For 29 years, he's been in the field of substance abuse prevention and education. He's been a researcher, trainer, coach, teacher, and lecturer.
We know kids' brains are this remarkable, flexible, unbelievable learning system, and one of the reasons we're so fascinated by what's going on is right now, when researchers look into kids' brains, we can see that up in this prefrontal cortex, there are more than 200 billion cells of activity, and even that's a new finding. We used to think that there were 100 billion cells at max in people's brains, but it turns out young people's brains have a collection of cells that I don't have anymore. Now, 200 billion cells is pretty astounding, given the fact that, you know, by the time you're an adult and you're up there a little bit in age, we're going to be running at about 110 billion cells. So here's a brain that has the capacity for accelerated learning, a brain that has this fired up, unbelievable amount of cells. But listen, you know, what's going on is these cells are connecting up, and these connections are going to be critically important, but when they connect up, the first roots are all local. So you don't have these big places where our brains, grown-up brains, can skip all around and come to a conclusion. And sometimes the 200 billion cells means there's too much for you to consider. So one of the things we know is that if you have a choice to make, sometimes the 200 billion cells actually slows you down. Now, we know there's some differences. There's individual variations, there's genetic coding, and actually there's some gender differences. Because we know when we look in the brains of females, 20, 21 years of age, we can actually see pathways maturing out, particularly in the part of the brain that deals with social, emotional, and relationship skills and development. We see they develop at around 20 to 21, they mature out. At what point would you think men's brains in social, emotional, and relationship areas mature out, do you think? It is 23, 24, and 25. We like to believe that kids have the invincibility method, that kids believe they're invincible. No research supports the idea that kids think they're invincible. In fact, many kids feel far more vulnerable to the randomness of the world than adults do. Instead, what researchers found is that there's no choice point. So here's the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. What happens is this brain starts going off in little sections one at a time. So it's not a choice. And it's not kids saying, nothing can happen to me, I'm invincible. We actually think this is a brain that cannot possibly project itself 15 years down the road in terms of this consequence. So if they can't do it, number one, why do we talk about it? Number two, how can we be disappointed or angry with them if it's not possible for their brain to project itself that far down the road? So what we're starting to learn is that when we talk about risks with kids, a far more valuable and productive way to talk about it is immediate social, emotional consequence. This brain is much more interested in the here and now because that's what it's connected up to. So we know it's changing. So look, right at about 13 years, 6 months, a site lights up, and that site is in between the prefrontal cortex, how do I think, and the limbic system, how do I feel, my emotions. And that site is right in the middle, and that site is actually a wonderful change when kids start to develop critical, independent thinking. But if you're the parent of one in the middle of the 8th grade, you may not find it so wonderful because the way it displays behaviorally is, number one, kids actually start to believe that they can analyze all the data and all the facts and they can come to their own conclusions and do not need your help to get there. They shortcut it with the phrase, I know. And last but not least, and this is important because it's normal and we expect it, and if we don't see this, we're going to be a little worried about it. Kids are much more willing to engage adults in open conflict right about the middle of the 8th grade and then on through high school. Now, open conflict is not bad. It means they tell you what they're feeling. If they're dismayed at how you're treating them or some interaction that's happening, it's just not always pleasant. Some of that conflict is not just going to be with you, it's going to be with peers. And if they don't develop an ability to say to their peers, I see what you're doing, I understand it, there's a strong pull that peers are going to have. I mean, look, we're talking about a brain that has a little spot right here that we call the amygdala. That little place gets 2 to 4 times larger and more active from about 12 to 24. This is the emotionally generating site in the human brain. So why wouldn't their peers be twice as important to them as our friends are to us? It makes perfect sense. They're all going through these same changes together. They have a ton of emotional intensity, and their need for social bonding is much stronger than our need. We like other people, but we don't need them at the same level. So there's a lot going on in this brain, and a lot of what's going on should be going on. That's why they're going to have 2 to 4 times the intensity of emotions. That's why some days they'll have between 20 and 24, I'm going to put ES, different emotional states. Why do they spend as much time concerned about their appearance and checking themselves in the mirror? Because it turns out in between cognition, how do I think, and emotion, how do I feel, researchers have discovered a bunch of sites that we call AA sites, or appearance attractiveness sites. Teenage brains have 5 times as many as you and I have. One of the things I'm going to ask kids when they make the Refuse to Use pledge is to think about refusing to make cutting comments about other people depending on their size, development, lack of development, weight, or attractiveness. That we know this is a brain that has almost a crushing impact when people say things that are unkind or disparaging about the way they look. One of the reasons we know kids use drugs and alcohol is based on their anxiety about themselves and the sometimes depression they feel about not being accepted and included. So if we can get people to understand how powerful that is and to make it emotionally safe to be a kid growing up in this section of Vermont, that's a pretty good deal. By and large, they can solve problems better than we can if something exists called a no-load problem solving. So here's what no-load means. There's no emotional stress on this brain. So here's a brain that's got unbelievable learning power and is pretty remarkable unless there's a big emotional load. Whatever the crisis is, you and I need to understand that there'll be chemistry that shows up for all of us. A compound called THP shows up under crisis. Under crisis, if you're a grown-up, if you have an adult brain, this chemical comes out, it turns anxiety down, and that's a good deal, and it takes the prefrontal cortex and actually floods it with more nutrients, more energy, and more blood. So the executive problem-solving making of the system of the brain is fired up, and the anxiety that makes you paralyzed is shut off. That's a pretty good deal. If you are between 9, now we don't know why this is, 9 and about 23 years of age, you get a THP run for whatever the crisis is. This brain gets flooded with THP, but instead of being helpful like it is for us, unfortunately for kids, it increases anxiety, adds a layer of agitation onto it. Okay? That's why they can't sit still when they're upset, and disconnects the prefrontal cortex. So what we're far more likely to see are kids under an emotional load making impulsive emotional decisions, and there's 2 things we can do about it. Number 1, understand that their brain does not function in that circumstance like ours. So saying to them, take a deep breath and think this through is not helpful. Number 2, under a powerful emotional load, particularly if they're in trouble, and you're having the talk with them, okay, the talk with them is better postponed till this chemical dissipates. Wait 20 minutes to a half hour. What about risk-taking? Well, what do we know about it? Two things. In that wonderful brain that they all have there, in a part in the middle, this limbic system, turns out there's these wonderful places called reward sites. So reward sites make life worth living. There's reward sites for all the things we love in life. But it turns out that right about age 13, we're going to see a flood of new reward sites here in an area that researchers know now is related to risk-taking. So what does that mean in a kid's brain? It means that now they have more sites, but no more chemistry than they used to have. And so here's places in the brain saying, come on, activate me. I want to give you a reward for taking a risk, but not enough chemistry to do it. So here's what it means. They can keep doing the same old skateboard tricks and not get any greater reward. Or they could give up risk-taking as a way of life. I'll vote for that. Okay. Or what's the third choice? You ratchet up the risk-taking. Here's the bigger risk. Is the big risk I'll get cirrhosis of the liver in 15 years? Or is the big risk the peers that I like and admire who want me to engage in this behavior and include me, okay, will stop asking me, stop hanging around with me, not punish me, not torture me, just not see me as a viable friend. And boy, in this brain, that is the bigger risk. Unsupervised, the easy access to drugs and alcohol in peers that they like and admire, that turns things into a much bigger risk. If your kids start to drink between 10 and 14, they're stealing from their brain the capacity for future cognitive function. Of all the kids who are going to start drinking this year, and that will not be all kids, but of all the kids who are going to start drinking this year, 32% of them will be 12 years of age or younger. Binge drinking freshmen are showing a 10% reduction in size in the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and in the hippocampus, the part that does social behaviors. What does that mean for binge drinking kids, particularly this part? This part means you don't get to stay in Duke because you can't do the work anymore, okay? But this part means something equally risky. Listen, kids who are binge drinkers by their junior year in high school are 7 times, I'm going to put ML. ML means more likely to have sex, 3 times less likely to use protection. So when we talk about the impact of alcohol on this brain, this is astonishing data and astonishing research. And what we're finding out is that if, as parents, working with your kids and talking with them openly about this, we can find these 5 things. Number 1, what are you learning about today? We're learning about kids' brains. Okay, that's great, because I want you to be able to listen when they talk. Get up in that dark, quiet room if they look distressed in the afternoon. Wait 2 or 3 hours. Get up in the dark, quiet room. Sit there and say, I noticed you kind of looked upset after school today. Want to tell me what's going on? The dark car. And if you're quiet, you're going to hear a lot of stuff, okay? I don't know that they talk so much more. Maybe because you have to have at least one hand on the wheel, I don't know. But what we know is that not face-to-face, but side-to-side activity frees kids up to tell you what's going on in their lives. I want you to be alert to changes. There's normal changes that are going on in kids' brains. Find out what they are and respond to them. I want you to be awake when they come home. We like to give kids the homecoming hug, but we've amended that to include 3 to 5 minutes of the homecoming talk. We want you to tell them what your values are. See, what I love about Refuse-to-Use, it says, we believe in you, in your promise, in your capacity, in your ability to make the right decisions. I love that. But I also want you to say this. If you cannot do that, I'll help you, and I'll help you with a consequence. Everyone makes mistakes. When kids make mistakes, you have a consequence. Keep it S&S. That's short and sweet. No consequence generally should go more than 2 to 3 weeks. Beyond that, you build resentment. Plus, you're not going to keep it anyway. And why are you going to act this way? Because you love them, and you have to tell them that. Because you want them to be your healthy, happy kids for their whole lives. Because you care for them. And care for has two big dimensions. One is you will be the taxi, okay? But you'll also be the person that has the boundaries.